NVIDIA's 40 Super Series cards are here, bringing refreshed performance at the same or reduced price point in the case of the RTX 4080 Super. But that's not the focus of today's video. Today we're getting a closer look at the RTX 4070 Super, which unlike the higher tier Super models, will actually be kind of coexisting with its non-Super counterpart at the same launch price of $599, whilst the original non-Super model has received a small price cut down to $549, at least for now. So how much extra performance are we getting over its predecessor for the same price? Well, we'll get into that, but first, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son. It is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Oh, thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
So, specs. The RTX 4070 Super improves upon the 4070 with an increased core count of 22%, accompanied by an increased power draw up from 200 watts to 225, which is a small increase, but still a fair bit under the 4070 Ti, which I guess this card is said to perform very closely to. This card is targeted at 1440p gamers, and as said, comes with a price point of $599, meaning it sits exactly where the 4070 launched, which could actually see this card offering a much more palatable value for money proposition, which has been something both Team Green and Team Red have, well, failed to hit in the last couple of launches. So what does it actually offer? 7,168 CUDA cores, 224 Tensor cores, 56 RT cores, 224 texture mapping units, 80 ROPs, and 48 MB2 cache. Now compared to its non-Super counterpart, this makes for a 22% increase in CUDA cores, Tensor cores, and RT cores, and also texture mapping units. It also offers a 25% increase in ROPs and a 33% increase in L2 cache. But it does stick with the same 12GB of GDDR6X memory on a 192-bit bus, providing 504GB a second of bandwidth. And breathe. Now, with us for testing, we actually have 4 MSRP cards: the Founders Edition from NVIDIA, the INNO3D Twin X2, the Palit DUAL, and the ZOTAC Trinity. It's quite a nice selection, all with different styles, designs, and all hitting that all-important $599 price point. Now, each of these cards, being MSRP, adhere to NVIDIA specs, so really, it all comes down to which offers the best cooling solutions, and of course, visual appeal. To which personally, yeah, the Founders Edition does really hold a strong lead, taking its professional look further with a darker, almost stealth black colour. But that's not to say the others are ugly by any means. But really, what I'm trying to say is it is subjective. Now, while we have already gone through some of the cards and their designs in our unboxing, which is on the channel, you may have missed that. So let's go through them all over again. So sticking with the Founders card, it's pretty typical of what you'd expect from NVIDIA. It looks practically identical to their other SKUs like the 4060, 4060 Ti and 4070, but the colours have had a shake-up, and I'm all for it. The Stealth Black isn't enough of a reason to upgrade from a non-Super card, though I'm sure there are some people out there who will buy it regardless because of that fact. Beyond that, there's nothing new on the design side of things. The card has 3 DisplayPort connectors and a single HDMI, and of course uses the 12V PWR connector. Opening the card up, if you've seen a Founders card apart, then you'll know exactly what's going on here, with a small PCB that features a curve that allows it to fit within the frame of the heatsink and cooler. There's 6 memory ICs, giving the card its 12GB total VRAM, but with the PCB having room for 2 more, maybe we could see a 16GB model at a later date, though I'm quite doubtful as it would bring the specs closer to the 4070 Ti Super, which is due out later this month. In terms of the power delivery, NVIDIA have done a good job on keeping the circuitry to one side, which is all covered by the large heatsink for the very best heat dissipation, something that the Founders cards have always been good at doing. There's also a lot of thermal pads that make direct contact with various components of the card and to help boost the cooling performance, and everything is quite densely packed with integrated heat pipes bridging the VRM cooler, GPU copper cold plate, and the rear fan sections all into a single unit. For the INNO Twin X2 card, it features the same clean industrial brushed fake metal / black plastic combo, and a large heatsink that we've seen with previous cards, which has proven to be more than capable of keeping the temperatures under control. It also features a full-length metal backplate with ventilation to allow the air to flow through the card from its 2 large fans. It has the same I/O output as the Founders card, and again uses the 12VH PWR connector too, so everything is pretty straightforward and what I'd expect from a Twin X2 card. And that's not a bad thing, because for an MSRP card, the range of GPUs that use this same cooler have always been a favourite of ours. Tearing down the card, we have the same 6 memory ICs that make up our 12GB, along with what looks like a slight upgrade on the circuitry side of things. More capacitors, more robust chokes, and all of this should allow for higher overclocks, which even INNO3D claim to have slightly higher headroom when compared to other MSRP-based cards. Now, when pushing your card, you'll want to deal with the heat in the best way you can, and the Twin X2 does have that covered along the backplate, which has 3 thermal pads to give some function over just a style choice, along with plenty of thermal pads directly making contact with the VRMs, VRAM, and surrounding components. The Palit DUAL card is much more simple in design, with a plastic shroud featuring some glossy and textured areas. Unlike the Inno card, the backplate on the DUAL is plastic and serves no real purpose other than making the card look nice, but it's definitely better than nothing. I'd say the Palit card is more aimed at those who just want a no-frills approach, and that's fine, because it takes out all of the unnecessary stuff like RGB or fancy features that won't get used by everyone, and that allows Palit to hit the MSRP, though if you do want that stuff, there's other models from their lineup to cater exactly for you. There's 2 large 92mm fans on the front, which should give us some improved cooling performance, so it seems Palit have been focusing more on that side of things instead of making it be the prettiest card. And again, I'm fine with that, as the card also comes with a 2550MHz boost clock, which is slightly higher than the 2475MHz that the FE from NVIDIA sports. Connector-wise, it has the same 3 DisplayPort connectors and a single HDMI, so nothing's changed there. And while it does use a 12VH PWR and is recessed, which looks great, plugging it in is a breeze, but trying to remove it is, well, a bit finicky, as there really isn't much room for anyone with above child-sized hands. Taking the cooler off, it's again a pretty simple affair like the other cards we've looked at, but for an MSRP card on what's arguably a mid-range GPU, I wouldn't expect anything crazy. In terms of cooling, the heatsink is nicely designed with an enlarged contact plate, ensuring that it covers both the GPU core and the VRAM from within the same contact area, with a smaller breakout heatsink making direct contact with the VRMs, with fairly thick thermal pads in all of the right places. The heatsink itself is split into 3 main sections with 4 modestly thick heat pipes that group together over the GPU core and then branch out towards each end of the card for the very best thermal transfer. Lastly, we have the ZOTAC Trinity, which has been a while since we saw anything from ZOTAC or the Trinity range, so it's nice to see it back in our offices. Now, I will mention that there is one downside, or upside depending on your needs, because the card is larger than the other ones we've looked at, and is much longer in length, though this I guess does allow for 3 fans versus the 2 that we've seen on the other variants, so there is an upside there. This will of course limit its compatibility with some smaller form factor cases, but should at least in theory mean that the overall cooling capabilities of the card could be increased compared to the competition. Now, even though it does have 3 fans, they are quite tightly packed in with very little space between them, and also running practically the full width of the shroud, which comes in at over 300mm in length, and the card is also slightly thicker than the others at 2.5 slots. So again, check your case if you're specifically eyeing this model up. Now, I will admit the fans look great, with 11 large fins per fan, all with 0 RPM functionality and a smart fan control function built in. And along with the thicker dimensions, it does mean the heatsink is a little larger too, so I'm expecting good things from it in terms of cooling. The other thing I like is the curviness of the card. It has a slight wavy shape to the shroud, which looks really actually nice and is featured on the backplate too. So no kind of sharp corners, which gives it, I guess, a very unique fluid look to the card, no matter the angle. Connection-wise, in case you hadn't guessed, 3 DisplayPort connectors and a single HDMI. So I think it's safe to say if you're after a card with different I/O options, you may be looking at something non-MSRP, if at all. The backplate is also full length and has plenty of ventilation towards the rear to allow heat to be exhausted more efficiently. And I really like the ZOTAC logo, which is painted in 2 colours that gives a sort of pearlescent paint effect. And as the backplate is what you're more likely to see, it's nice to see a bit of unique colouring. The end of the card is quite open, which gives us a glimpse of the 5 heat pipes that help transfer heat, and when opening the card up, we get a better look at what's going on. There are 3 blocks of thermal pads surrounding the GPU, but one does seem actually quite redundant as it's placed where there's, well, no components. So it wouldn't surprise me if the cooling solution is the same as something a little higher end. The backplate has 3 larger thermal pads too, which will of course assist the cooling potential of the card, along with those 3 larger fans. And then again, compared to the Founders card, it looks like the VRMs have been beefed up somewhat. But as a guy who believes manual overclocking, of course past world record chasers who utilise sub-zero temperatures, there's just many other factors at play when pushing your hardware. So I guess I really wouldn't be expecting too much if that's what you're looking for. So I'd like to think that all of these cards, especially as they come in at the same MSRP price, kind of have something going for them all, whether you're all about aesthetics or if cooling is more your bag, or a comfortable middle ground between the two. Also, with any launch, it wouldn't surprise me, like we've seen in the past, if it just comes down to grabbing what GPU you can before they all sell out fast. So luckily, we've looked at 4 here today. So what about performance? Well, that's where we went a little bit crazy and tested the NVIDIA Founders Edition to get a baseline in quite a few different games, and 3 resolutions, though we are focusing more on 1080p and 1440p here today. So if you want to see the rest of them, you can over on our Patreon. Now to test, we put the card onto our new GPU test bench consisting of an AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D on a Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master with 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB 6000MHz CL30 dual channel memory. All of our testing was done on Windows 11 with the latest updates applied and with the latest BIOS revision for the motherboard. The driver used was NVIDIA's 546.52 driver, and we'll be looking at quite a lot of games today before we take a look at overall averages. Though, as mentioned, if you want to see the data for all 3 resolutions in all of the games, you can do so over on our Patreon. The link for that is down below. And as this is all done on our new test bench, all of the data that we're actually showing here today is completely fresh and new, so everything has been retested. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. Starting things off with a Plague Tale Requiem, where the 4070 Super sees a pretty decent jump at 1080p with 17% extra FPS over the non-Super card, which means the Super now outperforms the RX 7800 XT by 11% and sits a small margin ahead of the 6950 XT and the RTX 3080 Ti. At 1440p, the Super performs 19% better than the non-Super variant, with the 7800 XT sitting a small margin behind, whilst the 6950 XT and the 3080 Ti do sit ahead, but only with a very small lead at just a few frames per second. So it's safe to say that you're getting pretty much the same performance here as those cards. Then at 4K we see performance drop a little, with us now only 6 frames higher than the 4070 non-Super. And whilst this does account to 18% more frames, it doesn't equate to much in the real world. With this increase, however, we do now line up exactly with the 7800 XT, where we were previously performing lower. And whilst the 6950 XT and the 3080 Ti do outperform the 4070 Super here, we've narrowed the gap a bit and the difference is now less noticeable. Baldur's Gate 3 is up next, and at 1080p we see a performance increase of about 15% over the non-Super 4070, which makes up a 21 FPS improvement, which also places the Super card now 8% above the RX 7800 XT, which previously outperformed the 4070. Now the Super has also narrowed the gap with the 3080 Ti, which sits just 4% ahead, and brought us closer to the 6950 XT, which seems to really like this game, and performed alongside the more expensive 4070 Ti, though it does suffer somewhat in the lows. But with that in mind, I'll be interested to see how the 4070 Ti Super improves upon this when it launches next week. At 1440p we see a 16% increase in FPS over the non-Super card, and again now places itself ahead of the 7800 XT. The RTX 3080 Ti does just barely outperform the Super with 4% more FPS, and once again we see the 6950 XT outperforming the 4070 Super, ending up with 13% more FPS on average, though it does come with 4GB more of VRAM, so maybe that's a secret. At 4K, the 4070 Super increases performance by 18% over its non-Super counterpart, with 11 FPS more on average. To no one's surprise, the 7800 XT gets beaten by the new Super card, which now sits 7% higher than the 7800 XT, whereas the 4070 non-Super used to sit about 9% behind the AMD card in the averages. Moving over to Call of Duty, and again we do see some gains, with the 4070 Super now packing around 11% more performance in the averages and a slightly larger 16% in the lows. This does mean that the Super card now beats the 7700 XT, though that doesn't sound all that impressive considering the extra 33% cost that the Super costs over Team Red's offering, and the still lower priced 7800 XT, which sits 17% ahead at 1080p. It's a similar story at 1440p. The Super manages to see a 14% uplift over the non-Super, which now puts it ahead of both the 3080 Ti and 7700 XT. But the margin is quite small at just under 5%. So while it's nice to see some competition, if you're basing your buying decision mainly on this game, the Super doesn't seem all that great in terms of value for money. But that could all change in other games. As we move up to 4K, the gains are still pretty sizable at 16% over the standard RTX 4070, and again this sees the Super just pushing ahead of both the cheaper 7700 XT and the 3080 Ti. And while the margins are larger at around 8%, I just don't know. Maybe I was expecting a little bit more, but we do still have a lot of other games to go. Cyberpunk sees the Super bridge quite a gap at 1080p, but it's a little bit of smoke and mirrors. While we do see an 11% uplift in performance over the non-Super, and the card moves up the stack in our charts, it's a bit of a lie, as the likes of the RTX 4090 is showing its severe bottleneck at this lower resolution. So I think it's safe to kind of take that one out of the equation. But other key metrics are how the 4070 Super now matches the performance of the 4070 Ti. But again, bottlenecks are rearing their ugly head here. 1440p is where this card is firmly set in terms of its sights, and it's here where it really gets to stretch its legs with a 36% lead over the non-Super, which practically matched the performance of the RTX 3070. Even after multiple retests, the RTX 4070 does well, but the Super really does manage to push those numbers up, which is impressive, though it's still let down somewhat due to the 7800 XT performing 6% better and for a cheaper price too. At 4K, the 4070 Super shows its largest gain yet of 48% over the non-Super, but it does still mean we're sitting at 37 FPS, which isn't all that great. Though as we move up the chart, the only card that can really tame Cyberpunk at 4K Ultra is the RTX 4090 at 65 FPS. So really, I guess it's horses for courses, and at this kind of extreme settings and resolution, the 4070 Super really isn't the one to go for. Enabling ray tracing in Cyberpunk as we move back to 1080p, and it's here where AMD doesn't really stand much of a chance. Firstly, the 4070 Super offers up 23% more performance compared to its predecessor, while also seeing a huge 68% lead over the 7800 XT and an astonishing 103% lead over the 7700 XT, as you'd expect, especially considering the higher price point. As we move up to 1440p, the 4070 Super commands a 20% lead over the non-Super, which now puts it around 9% slower than the more expensive 4070 Ti, so there's something. And at 42 FPS it is still playable, though DLSS, especially with frame generation, will definitely be your best friend here, and is something that AMD just don't have a solid answer to right now. At 4K with ray tracing set to Ultra, we do see a small 6% lead as we move from the non-Super to the Super, but that sadly equates to only 1 frame per second, and in all honesty, only the RTX 4090 is able to pull off what I'd class as playable performance, without DLSS being enabled. Moving on to F123, the 4070 Super does see a 48% FPS improvement, which equates to around 16% more performance at 1080p. Though as the game favours AMD, it's no surprise, even by a small margin, that the cheaper 7700 XT manages to push ahead slightly, albeit by 8 frames per second. At 1440 we see a smaller increase from the 4070 to the 4070 Super of 14%, which is still very much welcomed, but AMD is starting to act a bit like a thorn in the side for NVIDIA at this point, as the 7700 XT again comes in within a margin slightly faster, and again quite dramatically cheaper, whilst the slightly more expensive, but still cheaper 7800 XT sits further beyond that. At 4K, the 4070 Super finally takes a victory over the 7700 XT by a whopping 4 frames per second. While it's nice to see the 16% improvement over the 4070, which now manages to push beyond the 7700 XT, it's clear that Codemasters have really geared this title for AMD, and it does show, and well, that's a real downside for Team Green. As we move up to the ultra high preset, which enables ray tracing, we start to see the real benefits of what NVIDIA have done with the 4070 Super. Not only do we see a 19% uplift from the RTX 4070, but we now see performance that trumps the 7700 XT, 7800 XT, and 6950 XT. NVIDIA are, as they say, all in when it comes to ray tracing, and it shows in this test. At 1440p, it's a very similar story, a 21% increase in frames over the non-Super, and this accounts for a 13% lead over the RX 7800 XT, which was $100 cheaper at launch, so it could be argued in favour of each card either way. At 4K, the gains keep on coming with a 24% increase in performance, going from the RTX 4070 to the Super variant, which now again pushes ahead of AMD's 7800 XT by 18%, which isn't far off that extra 20% that NVIDIA want for their card, but for me, it just falls a little bit short. In Far Cry 6 at 1080p, there is an increase to be had of 10%, which puts it closer to the 4070 Ti, though AMD still come out on top in terms of the better priced 7800 XT, which comes in with the best 1% low scores we've seen too, making it one that's, well, really hard to ignore. At 1440p, where this card is firmly positioned, without sounding like a broken record, extra performance is there of 14% over the non-Super, but coming in 6% slower than the 20% cheaper 7800 XT is really a big point of contention, but we do still have a lot of games to go, so there is still a little bit of hope. At 4K, we do see a strong gain of 12% over the non-Super, but you can probably guess what I'm going to say, as the 7800 XT still manages another 8% beyond that at 103 frames per second. The 4070 Super is good, but just not good enough compared to the competition. Enabling ray tracing at 1080p gives us 10% more performance, which furthers the lead over the 7800 XT. So instead of seeing NVIDIA with a 13% lead, that now grows to a slightly healthier 24%, showing that NVIDIA definitely have the upper hand still when it comes to RT performance, at least at 1080p. At 1440p, the 7800 XT did manage to fight back as it sits 8% ahead of the RTX 4070, while the Super goes slightly further with a 4% lead, which could be argued as margin of error and in my opinion isn't enough to warrant the extra cost involved, and as this game doesn't have any form of DLSS, there really is no saving grace for NVIDIA here. Moving up to 4K, the 4070 comes in 10 FPS higher than its predecessor, which puts it in the same ballpark as the 7800 XT. But there really is no major talking point for buying NVIDIA over AMD in this game, which is said to favour AMD anyway. So if wanting to save money, the 7800 XT still seems to be the one to go for. Switching over to Hogwarts at 1080p, and again we do see a performance jump of 15% over the non-Super RTX 4070, which now puts it a margin of error ahead by about 3% over the 7800 XT. But in comparison, it does suffer in the 1% lows, where the 7800 XT manages to push ahead quite dramatically by over 30%. At 1440p, the 4070 Super now matches the performance of the 7800 XT, which is a nice uplift from the 4070 of 21%. But with the matched performance to AMD in the averages and falling behind in the 1% lows, along with the extra cost involved, again, AMD are the better choice. 4K sees another large jump going from the 4070 to the Super of 24%, but this now equates to just 1 FPS more than the 7800 XT, which again pushes ahead by some margin in the 1% lows of around 15%. AMD are constantly coming out more consistent and would clearly lead to a better gameplay experience overall. Ray tracing performance at 1080p sees another gain, this time around 13%, which propels the experience overall to one that's now 31% faster than the 7800 XT. Again, NVIDIA seem to do better in ray tracing performance as it now sits close to the 4070 Ti, while AMD hold the lead in rasterization. At 1440p, the 4070 Super does extremely well. Not only does it come in 24% faster than its non-Super counterpart, but now manages to beat the 4070 Ti, which even upon retesting showed the same results, though we're only talking 1 FPS here. On top of that, it does now hold a 46% lead over the 7800 XT, so it's finally starting to claw things back just a little. At 4K, the Super now matches the performance of the 3080 Ti, a card that was dramatically more expensive at launch, and further extends the lead over the 7800 XT, which the RTX 4070 was already sitting ahead by a small margin, though in the grand scheme of things, DLSS really is needed on a card like this to have an enjoyable experience, because even on an RTX 4090, 46 FPS isn't going to feel that great. Spider-Man at 1080p shows some severe bottlenecks as seen by our 4090, which doesn't top our charts. So really, there isn't much to talk about other than the 4070 Super coming in 11% faster than the 7800 XT. Though at 20% more cost, is it really a win? At 1440p, things line up a lot better with an 11% improvement over the non-Super card, which now puts it 18% faster than the 7800 XT and not too far behind the 4070 Ti at 191 FPS. So things are starting to look up ever so slightly. Spider-Man at 4K already had the 4070 non-super beating the 7800 XT, albeit by a single FPS, so margin of error. Whereas now the 4070 Super, thanks to its extra performance, holds a lead of 19% over AMD, putting it right where you'd want it to be. When enabling ray tracing, it's clear to see yet another bottleneck occurring, so really while we do see the higher performance when compared to what AMD has to offer, the data can be taken with a pinch of salt, as it doesn't really mean much, even when running a high-end CPU like the 7800X3D that we use today. Moving up to 1440p, there's still some bottlenecks occurring in the form of the 4080 and 4090, but the 4070 Super seems to have settled somewhat. We now get a 16% improvement over the non-Super, which just further extends its lead over what AMD have to offer in terms of the 7800 XT, as NVIDIA now sit 33% ahead of Team Red. Then at 4K, NVIDIA were already holding a lead over the 7800 XT by around 15%, but that has further extended to 19% now with the slightly faster supercard, so almost around where you'd expect considering the extra cost involved. Moving over to Ratchet and Clank at 1080p on the very high preset, and the 4070 was only just ahead of the 7700 XT, and fell behind the 3080 Ti. Whereas the 4070 Super makes up for it with a small marginal lead, and an uplift over the non-Super of 9%. Which is welcomed, but things still fall short when compared to the 7800 XT, where NVIDIA also seemed to suffer quite dramatically in this title in terms of the 1% lows. At 1440p, we do get a 14% uplift in performance over the non-Super, which also now means that NVIDIA sit above the 7800 XT. But again, it's really hard to ignore that while it's 2 FPS faster, it's also $100 more expensive. So personally, AMD have it beat yet again. It's a similar gain of 12% in terms of improvement over the RTX 4070 at 4K, which now edges past the 7800 XT, but 6% isn't enough to make it a valid price proposition, and I chalk that up as another win for Team Red based on value for money. When enabling ray tracing at 1080p, the 46% improvement is definitely more like it, as the Super now propels past anything AMD have to offer, especially as that means NVIDIA come out 40% faster overall compared to the 7800 XT. And this is definitely more like it. 20% more cost, 40% more performance. It's just a shame that not every game is like this. 1440p keeps up the performance improvements as the Super lends itself another 15% more performance over the predecessor, which now means the 4070 Super sits 47% ahead of the 7800 XT from AMD. Things are definitely starting to look up. 4K was looking pretty dire for the RTX 4070, let's be honest, at just 15 FPS, though the 4070 Super smashed it with a 160% increase in performance, now sitting just below the RTX 4070 Ti. Now, we did think this was a little bit odd, so we retested a few times but got the same 15 FPS result for the 4070. So I guess this newer title was really able to harness the extra RT cores to its full advantage. Lastly, in Starfield, the Super is the winner compared to AMD in terms of raw performance, as it leads the way by 4%. But again, thinking about bang for buck, that doesn't equate to anything remotely defined as being a good deal. Sure, the increase over the 4070 is nice, but AMD are constantly in this fight, even if performing slightly worse at times. At 1440p, the gap between those two cards draw closer, separated by just a single frame per second, meaning that AMD have this one sewn up as well. Why you'd pay more money for such a small margin of error gain just doesn't make any sense. Then finally at 4K we see the same, but AMD edge forward by a single frame per second, showing that while there is a minute increase over the non-Super, Team Green really have dropped the ball on this one. So the 4070 Super proves itself as an upgrade over the 4070, and in some cases sits just below the 4070 Ti. But it's extremely hard to ignore the price proposition that AMD firmly have in their favour. Now, one area where NVIDIA will of course have the upper hand is with AI upscaling, DLSS, and more importantly with frame generation. Now, for the sake of including some figures, we took the RTX 4070, 4070 Super and 4070 Ti and tested in various scenarios with DLSS disabled, enabled and then with frame generation turned on to see what kind of gains could be had at 1440p, where the 4070 Super is kind of targeted towards. It's here in Cyberpunk where we can see the already decent performance at 83 FPS is boosted as we enable DLSS, set to the balance mode, now sitting at 118 FPS. Though to take it one step further, we can actually increase the performance by a staggering 108% when going from no upscaling to DLSS 3 with frame generation, which would put this miles ahead of the competition and not that far away from the DLSS 3 performance of the 4070 Ti. For ray tracing, before we were sitting at a lowly 42 FPS, which is playable, don't get me wrong, but seeing a boost of 105% when enabling DLSS, again set to balance, now sees us at 86 FPS on a $600 GPU at 1440p with the preset set to Ray Tracing Ultra, so not too shabby at all. And again, not a million miles away from its bigger brother, the 4070 Ti. Again, FrameGen takes that further still with another 52% increase in performance, taking us just above 130 FPS. To look at one more game, we booted up Hogwarts Legacy, which was already giving us solid performance at 91 FPS, and with DLSS enabled to balanced, we managed to squeeze out another 70% more performance. Though again, to go even further, at 183 FPS, DLSS 3 gives us over 100% extra performance, just from the flick of a setting. Again, looking at ray tracing where performance drops down to just 51 FPS, DLSS really does act as a godsend here with a 53% boost when enabling DLSS, or a larger 127% increase with frame generation enabled. So some pretty great numbers overall. Okay, so where does it compete? That's the tricky one, as DLSS and upscaling to one side, the 4070 Super has a battle with AMD, as the 7800 XT is a great card, and AMD have clearly shown that they can compete in both rasterization and ray tracing, and I guess for a more affordable price point. And that to me really is the downfall for the RTX 4070 Super. The specs are admirable and would lead you to believe that things are improved, and in places it really is. I guess there's some sizable jumps here and there, and considering NVIDIA are launching this for the same price, it all seems good. But on the other hand, it does seem like this is what the RTX 4070 maybe should have always been. And I honestly don't feel like Team Green have done enough, because consistently through the tests, AMD were there, whether they performed better or worse, because even in the case of performing worse, it was only by a very small margin. And therefore, I guess you could say they still won in terms of offering far superior value for money. I think it's safe to say though, NVIDIA are hedging a lot of their bets on DLSS, and that's fine because it is becoming more common, but it's trying to get the consumers to all think with the same mentality, and that's going to be a battle, especially when money comes into it. Now, to get a better idea as to how this translates, it's worth taking a look at the value for money side of things and the overall averages, where straight away we can see that the 4070 Super does offer some healthy extra value when compared to the RTX 4070 non-Super, and also the 4070 Ti at $5.21. But other cards come in better, including the RTX 4060, which isn't great in the first place, but the big sticking point is that 7800 XT at $4.47 per frame, and even the 7700 XT at $5.01 per frame. Now, I'm under no illusion that the newer product will be more expensive, but $100 to come off of that price would see it fall much more in line with what AMD have to offer. Though, personally, I would actually be happy paying a little more, especially to get those DLSS features. Okay, so one final thing really, because we do have 4 cards here, it wouldn't be fair unless we looked at the cooling performance on every single one. So after an hour-long run of F123, the Founders Edition cooler kept temperatures about where we'd expect them to be. The GPU temperature sat around 73 degrees throughout, with the hotspot sitting at a slightly toasty 86 degrees. The memory came in at around 78 degrees, all while the fans did manage to stay fairly quiet at a little under 2000 RPM. So things could potentially be tweaked to be a little more aggressive without too much more noise. Now, in terms of the clock speed, we do see the GPU core clock sitting a hefty jump above the rated 2480 MHz boost clock at around 2730. Then, in terms of power, the Founders used around 218 watts of power, so NVIDIA are managing to set the bar pretty high for the other cards that we're looking at today. Moving on to the INNO3D Twin X2, we see the temperatures coming in a little cooler at 68 degrees on the GPU core, with the hotspot sitting around 10 degrees higher at about 78 degrees. The memory temperature also sat relatively cool at 66 degrees, so if anything is apparent, the cooler on this card is definitely doing its job, and with pretty low speeds on the fans at the same time at around 1760 RPM, meaning this is a cool and quiet card. When we look at the clock speed, we see that it comes in around 2715 MHz, so around the same kind of figure as the Founders. With this extra cooling potential, the card actually used slightly lesser power at 217 watts, so all in all, a pretty good result. Moving over to the Palit DUAL, where our temperatures sit much more in line with the Founders card, with a GPU core temperature of around 76 degrees and a hotspot at a much warmer 90 degrees on average, but the memory manages to stay at a more reasonable 78 degrees. Now, despite the higher temperatures, the clock speed still managed to match the other cards that we've looked at so far, with a core clock boost of 2700 MHz. Due to the slightly higher temperatures in places, the fan speed did sit, I guess, a little bit higher at around 1950 RPM, which is still somewhat quiet, all while using an overall power draw of around 216 watts. Lastly, since the ZOTAC has the beefiest cooler, I was expecting good thermal performance, and I wasn't disappointed, with the GPU core sitting at 68 degrees and around 78 degrees on the hotspot, whilst the memory sat at a perfectly reasonable 70 degrees, and for those lower temperatures, we are also seeing a very low fan speed of only around 1280 RPM. So you could easily boost that speed even higher while remaining very cool, though during our test, the boost was actually lower than the competition at 2640 MHz, though that's still higher than the official NVIDIA rated spec. Power is right where I'd expect it to be too, though it does have 3 fans where they're running at a lower speed, so it only actually uses 219 watts in total. So what's the bottom line? Well, I'm torn. I'm a big fan of the 4070 Super as a GPU, but I feel NVIDIA have just missed the mark yet again. Sure, it's a welcomed increase in specs and performance over the RTX 4070, but you'll probably remember how bad consumers commented on that when it launched, by the performance being somewhat lackluster based on the price. Now, AMD just seem to have the better product right now with the 7800 XT, and AMD fanboys would argue that AMD drivers are better, though I've heard it time and time again from both sides, so it's kind of irrelevant. Now, the one saving grace is, of course, DLSS, especially with frame generation. And this has always been the big point for NVIDIA, because AMD, even to this date, don't have anything that can compete on the same level. But I know there are people who will complain about fake frames, but it's hard to deny it's a pretty exceptional piece of technology, and I'm all for it. And all the time that NVIDIA have the upper hand there, well, AMD will always be just behind. That aside, what I do think is needed is for me to sit down and do a lot more tests on both the 4070 Super and 7800 XT, and we'll come up with a head-to-head video in the next few days. So let me know if you want to see that, because while we did show 16 games here today, with and without ray tracing, a bigger pool of games will give a better indication as to how well-rounded a GPU is. And I'm actually excited to see that, to see if there's anything that can help NVIDIA claw things back a bit, DLSS to one side. Now, we all know that some games are more AMD focused and some are more NVIDIA focused, so just having that bigger selection of games may paint a slightly different picture. What I will say is that the AIBs have definitely upped their game, no matter if you're looking at the Founders card for its beauty, the INNO3D for its cool operation, the Palit as a just good all-rounder, or the ZOTAC for peace and quiet. I feel that every 4070 Super we've looked at today has its merits. For now, yeah, that's going to wrap this one up. Let me know, do you agree with my thoughts? A good card, but it just misses the mark a little? Or have NVIDIA done enough with the help of DLSS? Honestly, I think I'm bang on the money. Unlike as it would seem here, NVIDIA. For now, if you enjoyed this video, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do and want to help support the channel, you can over on our Patreon, where you get access to a ton of cool exclusive benefits, including behind the scenes content, access to all of our charts, live streams, and much, much more. The link for all that great stuff is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.